Good evening, guys. Tonight we're talking about a tragedy that turned a night of celebration into absolute horror. On October 29th, 2022, over 130,000 people flooded into Itaewon for Halloween celebrations after years of COVID restrictions. Friends laughed, families texted loved ones to have fun, music filled the streets. But inside one narrow alleyway beside Itaewon Station, the crowds became dangerously packed. People started falling, and within minutes, hundreds were trapped so tightly together they couldn't breathe. By the end of the night, 159 people were dead. Tonight, we're diving into the full story behind the Itaewon crowd crush, the survivors, the warnings, the chaos, and the heartbreaking aftermath that still haunts South Korea today. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the darkness together. Halloween in South Korea is unlike almost anywhere else in the world. And if there was one place everyone wanted to be for Halloween in 2022, it was Itaewon. Nestled inside Seoul, just north of the Han River, Itaewon had built a reputation as the city's nightlife capital. A place packed with bars, clubs, late-night restaurants, rooftop parties, neon lights, and crowded alleyways pulsing with music until sunrise. It was energetic, chaotic, international. For many foreigners living in Korea, Itaewon felt familiar, almost like stepping into another world entirely compared to the rest of Seoul. And for young Koreans, especially after years of pandemic restrictions, it represented freedom. Because this wasn't just any Halloween. This was the first major Halloween celebration after COVID restrictions had finally been lifted. People had spent years locked down, isolated, unable to celebrate properly. So by October 29th, 2022, anticipation was enormous. Hours before sunset, partygoers across Seoul were already getting ready. Faces covered in makeup, costumes laid out across beds, wigs adjusted in bathroom mirrors, friends crowding into tiny apartments laughing, filming TikToks, and planning where the night would take them. Meanwhile, in Itaewon itself, businesses were preparing for one of the busiest nights of the year. Bars stocked endless rows of soju bottles and glasses. Restaurants rushed to prep food before the crowds arrived. Music blasted through open doorways as workers scrambled to get ready. Everyone knew the district would be packed, but few people truly understood just how crowded it was about to become. An estimated 130,000 people were expected to flood into Itaewon that night. And the problem was, Itaewon isn't very big. The streets are narrow, the alleyways even narrower, especially one particular downhill alley near the Hamilton Hotel, an alleyway that, within hours, would become one of the deadliest crowd crush sites in modern history. Nobody could have imagined what was about to happen in Itaewon that night. And that's important to remember, because sometimes after tragedies like this, people look back and ask why so many went there. Why the crowds kept growing, why people didn't just leave. But the truth is, these were ordinary people going out to celebrate Halloween. Students, couples, co-workers, friends finally able to enjoy life again after years of restrictions. Many of them had parents who knew exactly where they were going. This wasn't some hidden danger people knowingly walked into. It was supposed to be fun. For many, it was supposed to be the best night they'd had in years. Across Seoul, thousands of people spent that Saturday evening getting ready without the slightest idea that some of them would never come home. One husband and wife were on their way to a fancy restaurant for a birthday dinner. Their 25-year-old daughter had made the reservation herself as a gift for her father. Before heading out with friends to Itaewon, she texted him, "Go have fun with mom, and thank you for raising me. I'll repay you in the future, haha." It was the kind of message most parents would smile at and never think twice about. Hours later, their daughter would be dead. In another part of Seoul, a father watched his daughter excitedly show off her Halloween costume before leaving for the night. She was dressed as Princess Jasmine from Aladdin. Later, he would remember teasing her affectionately as she spun around in front of him asking, "Dad, don't I look pretty?" Elsewhere, another young woman told her father she was heading to Itaewon with friends. He trusted her completely, She was responsible, careful, the kind of daughter who wrote long, heartfelt letters for birthdays and anniversaries. Years earlier, when her father had been diagnosed with leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant, she turned out to be a match. She helped save his life. While he recovered in hospital, she wrote him letters reminding him to stay strong. In one of them, she said, "I'm so happy to have been born your daughter. Please don't get sick again, okay? I need you to stay with me for another 70 years. You have to cook me seaweed soup even when I'm 96. 3 years later, on October 29th, 2022, she died in Itaewon, and afterward her grieving father reportedly cried out, "You promised me. You said we'd be together for 70 years. But the tragedy didn't end that night. For some survivors, the nightmare followed them home. One of them was a 16-year-old boy, identified publicly only by his surname, Lee. He survived the crowd crush. His two closest friends did not. His parents became deeply worried in the weeks that followed. They arranged therapy twice a week. School counselors checked in on him regularly. They took his pain seriously. By all accounts, they did everything they could. But their son couldn't escape what happened. Before Itaewon, he had been quiet but happy. A good student, close with his family, always with the same two best friends, the Three Musketeers, as people called them. Now he was alone. 43 days after the crowd crush, on December 12, 2022, his parents received a final text message from him. "I'm sorry, Mom and Dad. Please don't forget me. Please remember me. I'm gonna go meet my friends." Later that day, he took his own life. He was 16 years old. The Itaewon crowd crush had already claimed 159 lives and injured nearly 200 others. But for some families, the tragedy kept unfolding long after the streets were cleared. Weekends like this were huge for Itaewon's economy. Halloween wasn't just a celebration. It was one of the busiest nights of the year for the entire district. Bars prepared for packed dance floors. Restaurants stocked extra food and alcohol. Club owners scheduled extra staff. Taxi drivers waited nearby expecting hours of non-stop fares as thousands of drunk partygoers eventually headed home. The entire city was preparing for a massive weekend. And most people traveling into Itaewon that night weren't driving. Parking in the area was already notoriously difficult, and with so many people planning to drink, the subway was the obvious choice. Itaewon Station sat right in the middle of the district, and just outside the station was a narrow alleyway that connected two of the busiest parts of the neighborhood: the subway exit and the main nightlife strip known as World Food Street. That alleyway would become the center of the disaster. During the daytime, it looked completely ordinary, just a cramped city passage lined with restaurants and storefronts, roughly 10 feet wide, about 130 feet long, sloping downhill toward the entertainment district. But the slope itself mattered. The alley wasn't smooth concrete. It was uneven brickwork, with some sections protruding higher than others. Even without crowds, it was the kind of place where you naturally watched your footing so you didn't trip walking downhill. And throughout Halloween night, thousands of people moved through that same narrow space, some heading toward the bars and clubs, others trying to leave, some moving uphill toward the subway, others squeezing downhill toward the nightlife. Two human currents colliding inside a confined space. As the evening went on, people started getting shoved. Some stumbled, others lost balance. Alcohol likely made things worse, but even sober, the alley was becoming dangerously overcrowded. The space simply wasn't built to handle that many people moving in opposite directions at once. And incredibly, warnings had already started coming in hours before the disaster. At approximately 6:30 p.m., the first emergency call was placed. The caller warned police that the alley near the Hamilton Hotel was becoming dangerous. People were packed tightly together. Some were struggling to move. Others were being pushed uphill by the pressure of the crowd behind them. The caller reportedly said, "I barely got out. It's getting too crowded. Someone could get hurt." The dispatcher asked, "Are people going to fall and cause a big accident?" And the caller answered, "Yes. It's really dangerous. You need to do something." The caller was told someone would check on the situation. But as the hours passed, almost nothing changed. And this is where the tragedy becomes especially difficult to talk about, because large events like this don't happen spontaneously. Cities prepare for them. Officials know crowds will gather. They know alcohol is involved. They know people become impatient, emotional, and difficult to control in confined spaces. That's why crowd management exists. Police presence, barriers, one-way walking systems, controlled entry points, officers monitoring dangerous choke points before they become deadly. But on October 29, 2022, witnesses repeatedly described something shocking. There was almost no visible crowd control in the alleyway. No officers directing movement, no systems separating foot traffic, no major intervention after multiple emergency calls warning that conditions were becoming dangerous. Meanwhile, the crowd kept growing. Tens of thousands of people squeezed deeper into Itaewon's narrow streets, and by the time the real disaster began around 10 p.m., the crowd had already become a trap. Around 7 p.m., nearly 3 hours before the deadly crush, the warning signs were already impossible to ignore. A large crowd had become stuck inside the alleyway near the Hamilton Hotel. At that point, the night still felt exciting more than dangerous. People were drinking, laughing, taking photos in costumes. Halloween energy was everywhere. But inside that narrow slope, movement had already started breaking down. People trying to go downhill toward World Food Street were colliding with people attempting to move uphill toward the subway station. The crowd slowed to a crawl, inching forward, then backward, then stopping completely. One woman inside the crowd immediately sensed how dangerous the situation was becoming. So she climbed onto a small ledge along the alleyway wall and began directing people herself, almost like an unofficial traffic officer. She shouted, "Let the people going downhill pass first. Move to the side. Then let the people coming uphill go afterward." And incredibly, for a while, people listened. Others in the alley started yelling, "Listen to the woman. Move first. Make space. Make space." At that point, the situation was still manageable. Dangerous, yes. Chaotic, definitely, but survivable. The crowd eventually loosened enough for people to get through. Yet afterward, many left with an uneasy feeling they couldn't shake. Earlier in the evening, social media posts about Itaewon had been full of excitement. "This place is insane tonight. Best Halloween ever. Look at all the costumes." But as the hours passed, the tone online began changing. People started posting warnings instead. One person tweeted, "This feels wildly unsafe right now." Others uploaded photos showing streets so packed that people could barely move. And it wasn't just social media noticing something was wrong. People were calling police repeatedly. One survivor later described entering the alley around 8 p.m., 2 full hours before the disaster officially began. She said, "It already felt like hell." According to her, the alley was so overcrowded, she and her friend couldn't even fully enter it after waiting nearly an hour. Eventually, they decided to turn around, but by then, they couldn't. The pressure of the crowd behind them trapped them in place. People behind them kept pushing downhill, shouting, "Squeeze in, keep moving." Meanwhile, people in front were screaming something completely different. "Help me, stop pushing, I can't breathe." At one point, someone near her fell. Then she fell too. And suddenly people started collapsing one after another like dominoes. She later described being pinned beneath other bodies, barely able to inhale. Music blasted from nearby clubs while people screamed for help. She said she felt invisible, like nobody could even hear them. Eventually, someone managed to pull her sideways into a nearby bar, likely saving her life. But when she later left by hugging the wall of the alleyway, the crowd was still growing, still compressing, still dangerous, and the emergency calls kept coming. One caller reportedly told police, "I think I'm going to get crushed." Another said, "It's total chaos, please send help." Dispatchers reassured callers that officers would respond, but records later showed that response was minimal. Over the course of the evening, numerous emergency calls warned authorities the crowd was becoming dangerous, yet police reportedly only dispatched officers to the area a handful of times. And after approximately 9 o'clock p.m., despite the escalating panic, no additional officers were sent specifically to control the alleyway. What makes this even harder to process is that some people physically walked into the police station to warn them. One live streamer who had been filming Halloween festivities that night later described how quickly the atmosphere changed. At first, everything felt fun. Then the crowds became so intense, she was shoved repeatedly until the strap of her crossbody bag snapped clean off her shoulder. She lost her purse somewhere beneath the moving crowd, but the pressure of bodies was so extreme she couldn't even look down to search for it. Eventually, she went directly to the Itaewon police station to report the missing bag. And while speaking with officers, she warned them, the crowds are out of control. People are falling. People are getting hurt. Something bad is going to happen. According to her account, officers focused mostly on the missing purse report. They told her someone might turn it into lost and found the next day. About an hour later, the deadly crowd crush began. Another live streamer was documenting his night in Itaewon in real time, and at first the footage looked exactly like you'd expect from Halloween night. Crowds laughing, people dancing in costumes, music echoing through the streets. You can hear the excitement in his voice as he walks through the district filming everything around him. But slowly, the atmosphere changes. The joy starts fading from the footage. The laughter is replaced by shouting, then screaming, then panic. At some point during the stream, he enters the alleyway near the Hamilton Hotel and gets trapped in the crowd surge himself. Later, he described the pressure becoming unbearable, tighter and tighter and tighter, until breathing itself became difficult. Standing next to him was a young woman much shorter than he was. She began screaming for help. The streamer said he tried to create space for her with his body, but there simply wasn't room. The crowd was too compressed, too powerful, and then he watched her face slowly change color, purple. The screaming stopped, and she died standing beside him. The streamer later said the only reason he survived was because another man, someone he described as wearing a blue denim jacket, pulled him upward onto a narrow ledge built into the wall of the alleyway. There wasn't much space, just enough room to stand, but once he got up there, the streamer began helping pull other people out of the crowd too. One by one, desperate strangers clawing upward just trying to breathe. At one point, people already standing on the ledge reportedly began begging him to stop pulling more people up, because there was no room left. The ledge itself was becoming dangerous, but he answered, just one more, and then another and another. He estimated that together, he and the man in the denim jacket helped save somewhere between 5 and 10 people from being crushed. But what makes the story even more haunting is this. The man in the denim jacket stayed inside the crowd for as long as possible. Instead of climbing to safety immediately, he allowed weaker people to use his shoulders and body to reach the ledge first. Eventually, he survived too. After finally climbing up himself, he reportedly stayed behind to help administer CPR to victims afterward. Many people now believe that unnamed stranger saved more than 10 lives that night. And yet, around them, conditions kept worsening. The crowd compressed tighter and tighter until hundreds of people were pinned together inside a space survivors later described as being no larger than half a classroom. Hundreds of human bodies packed so tightly people physically lost control over their own movement. And this is something experts repeatedly emphasized after the tragedy. At a certain point in a crowd crush, it no longer matters what individuals want to do. You cannot simply move back. You cannot make space. The crowd itself takes over. One survivor described seeing a man waving a flashing baton, desperately signaling for people to move backward. But nobody could, not because they refused, because they physically couldn't. Every direction was blocked by bodies. The pressure became so intense that people couldn't even raise their arms properly to protect their chests or lungs. Some survivors described seeing people tilt their heads upward toward the sky, desperately searching for air. Others appeared dizzy, disoriented, on the verge of fainting. Many people trapped in the center of the crowd couldn't even lift their hands far enough to check the phones already clutched inside them. And while all this was happening, missed calls and text messages kept coming through. Parents trying to reach their children. One mother repeatedly texted her daughter, "Where are you? I'm so worried. Please just tell me you're safe." The daughter's contact name in her phone was saved as "My oldest princess." She never replied. There are multiple videos from that night showing just how catastrophic the situation became. And even now, they're difficult to watch. In one clip, you can see a man desperately clinging to a single brick protruding from the alley wall, trying to keep himself elevated above the pressure of the crowd below him. Other videos show what appears to be empty space farther down the alleyway, almost like an opening in the crowd. And afterwards, some people online questioned it. Why didn't they just move forward? There's space right there. But the videos don't show what was underneath. Bodies. People had already fallen. Victims were stacked on top of one another so densely that those still standing physically couldn't move forward even if they wanted to. The crowd behind continued pushing. The people in front had nowhere to go. And those trapped in the middle became compressed between them. Survivors later described it like dominoes. One person falls, then another, then dozens more collapse on top of each other under the force of the crowd. At the height of the surge, reports suggested bodies were piled as high as 13 feet in some areas. And one of the most horrifying parts of crowd-crushed disasters is this. You don't necessarily have to fall to die. The pressure alone can kill you. As bodies compress together from every direction, the chest can no longer expand enough to draw in oxygen. You're conscious, you're trying to breathe, but your lungs physically cannot inflate. Experts later explained that someone being severely crushed can lose consciousness in as little as 30 seconds. Death from compressive asphyxia can happen within minutes. When news of the tragedy first spread internationally, many people assumed it had been a stampede. But survivors and investigators clarified something important. This wasn't people being trampled by a running crowd. It was a crowd surge, a human compression event. More like being trapped underwater or buried alive than being knocked out in chaos. People were pressed so tightly together that movement became impossible. Some victims reportedly lost consciousness while still standing upright because the crowd was holding their bodies in place. Others described feeling themselves lifted completely off the ground by the force of bodies pressing from every direction, their feet no longer touching the pavement. And afterward, the alleyway was left covered in abandoned shoes, hundreds of them, because the pressure of the crowd had literally pulled them off people's feet. One of the victims trapped in the crowd that night was a 21-year-old man from Malaysia named Raghu. Friends described him as incredibly hardworking and gentle. He worked construction jobs in South Korea, sending money back home to help support his parents in Malaysia. According to his best friend Kim, Raghu wasn't the type of person who complained much. He was patient, kind, quietly dependable. And while trapped inside the crowd surge that night, Raghu called Kim. At first he tried to stay calm, but Kim could hear fear in his voice. Raghu told him, "I'm having a hard time breathing." Then he mentioned something else. There was a woman beside him who had started fainting. Even while he himself was trapped and struggling for air, Raghu was trying to help her. He told Kim he was attempting to get medical attention for the woman because she urgently needed help. Imagine that for a moment. Hundreds of people compressed together, bodies collapsing, panic spreading, and this young man's focus was still on saving someone else. Kim stayed on the phone with him, helplessly listening from the other end, unable to reach him, unable to do anything. Then, at one point, Raghu reportedly told him something haunting. The woman's hand had gone cold. Not long after that, the call disconnected. It was the last time Kim ever heard his friend's voice. Raghu died in the crowd crush that night. At around 10:30 p.m., emergency services began receiving calls reporting that people had fallen inside the alleyway and were being crushed beneath the crowd. One report mentioned around 10 people down on the ground struggling to breathe. In reality, it was likely far worse already. But in the chaos, callers could only describe what they themselves could see. Within minutes, the first ambulances were dispatched, then more. And finally, police officers began arriving at the scene. But by this point, The situation had already spiraled beyond normal crowd control. And I do want to make an important distinction here. In the aftermath of the tragedy, several senior officials faced criticism and investigation for failures in planning and response. But many of the frontline officers and first responders arriving at the alley that night were simply trying to help the best they could in an unfolding catastrophe they had not prepared for. Most of them were not the people making executive decisions earlier in the evening. They weren't the ones ignoring emergency calls. They were just being told where to go after the disaster had already begun. One officer later identified publicly was police officer Kim Baek-gyam. According to reports, he wasn't even originally dispatched directly into the alleyway. He was already on duty nearby when he came across the situation himself. And when he reached the scene, he immediately realized how catastrophic things were becoming. People trapped in the crowd were already being dragged out by civilians. Regular bystanders were performing CPR in the streets before emergency crews could even fully organize themselves. Officer Kim later said he tried to figure out the fastest way to stop things from getting even worse. His solution was simple: prevent more people from entering the alley. So he began trying to redirect crowds away from the area. But even that became incredibly difficult. Most people elsewhere in Itaewon had no idea what was happening inside the alleyway. Music was still blasting, bars were still open, people were still arriving from the subway station expecting a normal Halloween night. And adding to the confusion, many people were wearing police costumes for Halloween. So even though Officer Kim was in an actual police uniform, not everyone immediately realized he was genuinely law enforcement. Some people reportedly kept trying to move past him toward the alleyway, unaware that just a few feet away, people were already dying. Officer Kim later described trying to push through the crowds, yelling for people to turn back. But the streets were so loud, so packed, that many either couldn't hear him or didn't understand the urgency. He reportedly shouted things like, "Please go home. Please turn around. Don't go forward. People are dying." At times he even climbed onto restaurant tables and elevated surfaces, trying to make himself visible above the crowd. Anything to get people's attention. Anything to stop more bodies from funneling toward the alley. But there was another problem. He didn't have a megaphone. Later, during interviews after the tragedy, Officer Kim explained that he hadn't been formally dispatched there with crowd control equipment. He had simply encountered the disaster while already on duty nearby. And according to him, going back to retrieve a megaphone would have wasted valuable time while people were actively dying. In one emotional interview afterward, he broke down crying. He said he kept replaying the night in his mind over and over, wondering if there was something more he could have done. He reportedly said, "I kept thinking, if I had moved faster, if I'd had a megaphone, if I had handled things differently, maybe one more person could have survived." Then apologizing directly to grieving families, he said, "I tried my best to rescue them. I'm sorry, I just couldn't." One photographer, visiting from China, had come to Itaewon that night for a completely different reason. He'd heard Halloween in Itaewon was legendary. The costumes, the energy, the nightlife. He thought he'd spend the evening taking photographs of people celebrating after years of COVID restrictions. Instead, he found himself trapped inside the crowd surge. Later, he described clinging to a pole inside the alleyway just to avoid losing his balance and falling, because by that point, people understood something terrifying. If you fell, there was a very real chance you would never get back up. Standing in front of him were two women, and every time another wave of pressure surged through the crowd, he instinctively reached forward to stabilize them. Not because he knew them, but because he knew if they collapsed, they could die. And even while he himself struggled to breathe, his focus was still on trying to protect strangers around him. He later said there were many people doing the same thing that night, helping each other however they could. At one point, he noticed a family trapped in the crowd nearby, a mother, a father, and a small child who looked maybe 3 or 4 years old. The family didn't appear to be partying. They likely had simply been trying to pass through the area, either heading home or toward the station, when they became trapped in the crush. The father was holding the child above the crowd with his arms stretched upward, so the little one wouldn't be crushed. And according to the photographer, something remarkable happened next. People in the crowd began working together. Strangers reached upward, carefully passing the child from person to person toward safety. Eventually, the child was lifted into a nearby business along the alleyway. One small life pulled out of the chaos by complete strangers. The photographer himself survived, but when he returned to his hotel afterward, he was deeply shaken. He later said he checked his camera roll and realized he had taken only 3 photos all night, all of them before the tragedy. And in every picture, people looked happy, laughing, posing in costumes, enjoying life, just normal people celebrating Halloween. Then his wife called him from China. The couple had recently had a baby together. She asked him how his night was going, and he lied. He told her he'd simply come back early because he wasn't really feeling it. He couldn't bring himself to tell her what he had witnessed. He didn't want her panicking while he was still so far from home. He later admitted he didn't tell her that he had spent the night watching people die around him, and one of the most heartbreaking things survivors consistently described afterward was this. Even during the most traumatic moments of their lives, even while fighting for air, many people were still trying to save others. One young girl became separated from the adults she had arrived with. At some point during the crush, she fell, and in a crowd surge, falling can be fatal within seconds. But according to witnesses, a man nearby grabbed her and helped pull her back upright before she disappeared beneath the crowd. That single action likely saved her life. The girl never learned his name. She never had the chance to thank him, because the man who helped her became trapped himself shortly afterward, and he died that night. His name was Lee Ji-han. He was only 24 years old. In South Korea, he was known as a rising actor and entertainer with a bright future ahead of him. Friends and colleagues described him as charismatic, warm, and full of energy. At the time of his death, he had reportedly just been cast in a new fantasy drama that many believed could have become his breakout role. But he never got the chance. After learning what had happened, the little girl's parents later publicly thanked Lee Ji-han's family for his courage. A stranger gave their daughter a future that night, and it cost him his own life. By 11 p.m., the scale of the disaster was finally becoming undeniable. 30 additional ambulances were dispatched to Itaewon, then more personnel, national disaster medical assistance teams, firefighters, police officers, emergency responders from across Seoul. Resources were now flooding toward the area, but for many victims, it was already too late. By 11 p.m., the scale of the disaster was finally becoming undeniable. At 11:19 p.m., officials officially called off Halloween festivities in Itaewon. And just before midnight, the fire department issued a Stage 3 emergency response order, something typically reserved for major large-scale disasters, the highest level. But even once emergency crews fully arrived, there was very little they could actually do except attempt to save the people still clinging to life. The alleyway had transformed into complete chaos, bodies everywhere. People screaming for help, others unconscious, dozens already in cardiac arrest. And adding to the confusion was something uniquely horrifying about Halloween night itself. Many partygoers were dressed as police officers, firefighters, doctors, and paramedics as part of their costumes. So in the middle of flashing lights, deafening music, panic, and crowds, people genuinely struggled to tell who was an actual first responder and who wasn't. Even emergency personnel later described the scene as disorienting. And afterward, one painful question echoed across South Korea again and again. Could more people have survived if help had arrived sooner? Many medical professionals later speculated that yes, some absolutely could have, because with compressive asphyxia, time is everything. Once oxygen is cut off long enough, brain damage can begin within just a few minutes. Survival windows become terrifyingly short, and despite the chaos, many ordinary civilians stayed behind trying desperately to help. Rows of strangers performed CPR side by side in the streets of Itaewon. Some people worked on victims for long periods of time, waiting for ambulances to arrive. Others carried unconscious strangers out of the alleyway themselves. But there was another side to the aftermath too. one that deeply disturbed many people in South Korea afterward. Because while emergency crews were performing CPR nearby, while bodies lay motionless in the streets, some people continued partying. There are viral videos from that night showing music still playing, while ambulances lined the roads nearby. Some bystanders were filming the scene on their phones, rather than moving out of the way. Reports later claimed that in certain areas, crowds gathering to watch or record the tragedy actually slowed emergency responders trying to reach victims. For many Koreans, those images became impossible to understand. How could people continue celebrating while others were dying only feet away? But in disasters like this, confusion spreads quickly. Some people didn't fully understand what was happening. Others were likely in shock, and many simply could not comprehend the scale of the tragedy unfolding around them yet. As the crowd finally began to thin out, the alleyway slowly became visible again, and what responders found underneath was devastating. Hundreds of people lying motionless across the pavement, many needing CPR immediately, many already beyond saving. Anna had traveled to Itaewon from Spain with a group of friends for Halloween weekend, and at first the night felt exactly the way everyone imagined it would. Bars overflowing with people in costumes, groups laughing and taking photos, music blasting through the streets. Just excitement everywhere. But Anna later said that when she stepped back outside after being in one of the bars, it felt like the world had transformed, almost instantly. She described it as looking like an apocalypse. Before she could even process what she was seeing, people started running toward her and her friends shouting, "Do you know CPR? Can anyone do CPR?" Anna herself didn't know how, but some of her friends did. So they immediately ran toward the chaos, while Anna stood frozen outside the restaurant, confused and overwhelmed. Only a few minutes later, her friends returned, and they were hysterical, crying, screaming. According to Anna, they kept saying, "We tried to save them. We tried to save 5 or 6 people, but they died." Then Anna followed them back into the streets to help however she could. She later admitted she didn't really know what she was doing. Others were simply giving instructions in real time. Hold their head, open their mouth, help keep the airway clear. So she tried, because everyone was trying. But many of the victims they reached had already stopped breathing. Anna later described the entire scene as deeply traumatic. Sirens blaring, people screaming for help, others sobbing beside bodies in the street. And somehow, unbelievably, music from nearby bars was still echoing through Itaewon, while paramedics and civilians performed CPR only feet away. The streets became this surreal collision of celebration and catastrophe, bright neon lights flashing across rows of unconscious victims, ordinary people suddenly forced into becoming rescuers, boyfriends performing CPR on girlfriends, friends trying to revive friends, strangers kneeling beside complete strangers refusing to give up on them. One man helping that night was a nurse from Pakistan who had been visiting South Korea to see his brother. The brothers had gone to Itaewon simply out of curiosity to experience Halloween there. Instead, he spent the entire night performing CPR, over and over and over again. He later estimated he attempted CPR on somewhere between 15 and 30 people that night. And anyone trained medically knows how physically exhausting CPR is, even on one person. But he kept going because there were so many victims and not enough hands. Later, he said what stayed with him most was how hard ordinary people fought to save each other. People who had never met, who didn't even know each other's names, just trying desperately to keep strangers alive. But the trauma followed him home afterward. The next morning, he said he couldn't sleep because all he could hear in his mind were screams. "Help me, help me." And months later, he admitted those voices still hadn't left him. Another heartbreaking story involved a young college couple who had planned to get married in May of 2023. They were trapped together inside the crowd surge. According to reports, the boyfriend did everything he could to shield his fiancée with his own body. He tried to keep her upright, tried to stop her from falling, but eventually he lost consciousness himself, and the two became separated in the crowd. When he woke up, medical personnel reportedly told him he needed immediate treatment himself. But he refused. Instead, he desperately searched for his girlfriend, and when he finally found her lying on the ground, he performed CPR on her for over an hour. She never came back. As the scale of the disaster became clearer, another devastating reality emerged. Most of the victims were women. Many were younger women. And experts later explained that in crowd-crushed disasters, smaller body size and shorter height can make people more vulnerable to compressive forces. Paramedics moved through the streets attempting CPR on victim after victim. To perform CPR effectively, responders often had to unbutton shirts or loosen clothing so victims could breathe more easily and compressions could be done properly. That is completely standard emergency procedure, but even in that moment, with people literally fighting for their lives on the pavement, some bystanders reportedly pulled out phones and started filming victims because parts of their clothing had shifted or become displaced during rescue efforts. Witnesses later described people screaming at onlookers, "Stop filming! Stop recording and help!" Many victims had lost shoes in the crush. Some had damaged or displaced clothing from being compressed beneath layers of bodies. And afterward, many people in South Korea expressed heartbreak and anger that some victims were stripped of dignity, even in their final moments. By this point, hundreds of people were lying across the streets of Itaewon, awaiting medical treatment, CPR, or identification, and responders were rapidly running out of time. Once authorities finally managed to clear portions of the alleyway and push crowds back, the focus shifted entirely to rescue efforts. Victims were rushed toward ambulances, toward hospitals, toward any available medical care. But by then, for many people, it was already too late. There were simply too many victims, not enough ambulances, not enough space, not enough time. Some victims reportedly remained lying on the streets for over an hour because responders physically could not transport everyone quickly enough. One Chinese student who had been partying elsewhere in Itaewon that night later said she had absolutely no idea what was happening. She'd been inside one of the larger bars the entire evening, and when she finally walked outside around 2 a.m., roughly 4 hours after the crowd crush had begun, she said it felt like stepping into another world, or the end of one. She described paramedics everywhere performing CPR on motionless bodies beneath flashing emergency lights, sirens still echoing through the streets, and rows of people lying beneath blankets. She later said, "It felt like I was confronted with corpses." At 2:30 that morning, authorities released the first official death toll: 59 dead, around 150 injured. But the numbers kept rising. An hour later, the death toll jumped again, and eventually, the final number would reach 158 victims killed in the crowd crush itself. Another life would later be lost to suicide, connected to the trauma of the disaster. Many survivors later spoke about the physical sensation of being trapped inside the crowd. One Chinese survivor said that even thinking about that night still made her feel like she couldn't breathe. She believed one reason she survived was because she was slightly taller than many others trapped around her. Even then, she described the pressure on her chest as feeling like hundreds of pounds crushing inward from every side. She could barely stretch her neck upward enough to catch air. At one point, her neck became pinned painfully to one side, and she physically could not turn away. And because of that, she was forced to watch the young woman beside her suffocate to death, unable to help, unable to even look away. Soon afterward, she felt something warm hitting her back. Later, she realized the person behind her had been vomiting blood onto her during the crush. She said the crowd was so tightly compressed, she couldn't even move her fingers. Her legs went numb for nearly an hour. Eventually, firefighters managed to pull her from the crowd and carry her to the roadside before rushing her to hospital. Months later, she reportedly still needed medical scans because breathing remained painful from the compression injuries she suffered that night. Another survivor, a 23-year-old Mexican student named Juliana who was studying in Seoul, described a similarly horrifying experience. She and a friend had gone to Itaewon together and were attempting to leave through the alleyway around 10 p.m. The moment they entered the crowd, they became separated. Juliana later described the crush as feeling like an uncontrollable force. Her feet literally lifted off the ground. She couldn't move backward, couldn't move forward. The crowd decided where her body went. At one point, an unconscious person collapsed onto her. She started hyperventilating, then slowly began blacking out. She later said the noise around her started fading until everything sounded distant and muffled. She couldn't feel her legs anymore, couldn't move even a single toe, and at some point, she genuinely believed she was about to die, that she was simply waiting for it to happen. Then somehow, according to Juliana, a young man standing elevated on the edge of the alleyway managed to grab her and pull her free. She had been trapped for nearly 50 minutes. When she finally escaped, she said bodies were everywhere around her. Although she survived, the damage to her body was severe. The following day, she developed a high fever and was hospitalized. Doctors diagnosed her with necrosis in her leg, tissue damage caused by lack of blood circulation during the crush. In the end, 158 people lost their lives in the Itaewon Halloween disaster. Victims came from all over the world, including 26 foreign nationals from 14 different countries. The majority of those killed were young people, and most were women. Official figures later recorded 102 female victims and 57 male victims. Nearly 200 others suffered physical injuries, but the psychological damage spread far beyond those numbers. Survivors, families, first responders, witnesses, many would spend months, and in some cases years, trying to process what they had seen that night in Itaewon. As news of the disaster spread across South Korea, parents became glued to their phones, calling, texting, refreshing the news over and over again. Many families spent hours desperately trying to reach children who had simply gone out for Halloween with friends. And for some parents, the confirmation came in the worst possible way: a phone call from authorities. One mother later said she refused to believe her son was dead when officials first informed her. She said, "I didn't believe it until I got to the hospital. I didn't believe it until I saw my son with my own eyes." Afterward, she described how completely shattered their family became. According to her, the boy's father later attempted suicide from the grief, and their surviving daughter, devastated watching her parents suffer, would cry and say, "It should have been me. It should have been me instead." Another mother rushed to the hospital after hearing her daughter might have been involved, and there she was forced to identify her own child. Later, she said the image never left her mind. She reportedly said, "When I go to bed, I still see her face. I can't sleep anymore." For many parents, one of the most painful parts was how ordinary the night had looked right before everything changed. One family later went through their daughter's phone, trying to understand her final moments. At 9:35 p.m., she had been taking smiling photos inside a bar with friends. Happy, laughing, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Then around 10 p.m., she messaged a friend saying she was heading home and walking toward Itaewon Station. She even took a few more photos after that, still smiling. And somewhere between leaving the bar and reaching the subway station, she was swallowed by the crowd surge. Her friend, who survived, later explained something chilling. They hadn't even intended to enter the alleyway itself. The surrounding streets had become so densely packed that it felt like the crowd physically pulled people inward, like a vacuum. Once inside, there was no control anymore. The surviving friend later said conditions became so intense, she lost her shoes entirely. At some point, her feet weren't even touching the ground. The pressure of the crowd was simply carrying her body wherever it moved. The two friends became separated. One survived, one didn't. And afterward, the girl's parents would repeatedly look through the final photos stored on her phone. Her father reportedly stared at the picture, saying, "She's smiling. Look at her face. Look at her smile." And her mother, through tears, said something devastatingly simple: "She was my best friend." In the days after the tragedy, grief spread across South Korea in waves. At one press conference filled with devastated parents, raw emotion finally broke through the room. At one point, anguished voices could be heard shouting, "Take us instead, and bring our children back." And one of the most heartbreaking details was how many parents reportedly apologized to their children after their deaths, as if somehow they had failed to protect them. as if they should have been able to stop something no parent could ever have imagined happening. In the aftermath of the crowd crush, more than 1 ton of belongings were reportedly left behind in Itaewon. Personal items scattered across the alleyway and surrounding streets. Shoes, bags, jackets, phones. The final traces of people who had gone out expecting a normal Halloween night. Authorities later gathered the items inside a gymnasium in Seoul so families could search for the belongings of loved ones. According to reports, there were 123 handbags, 258 pieces of clothing, and 256 pairs of shoes. Rows and rows of silent objects waiting to be identified. And honestly, sometimes those details hit harder than statistics ever could. Because every single pair of shoes belonged to someone. Someone who had plans for the next morning. Someone who was loved. Someone who expected to go home. By November 1st, funeral homes across Seoul had become overwhelmed. Many were filled almost entirely with young victims. People who had only just begun their adult lives. University students, recent graduates, young professionals. Some had only recently finished high school. One funeral home held the body of 28-year-old James Sims, and in the room next door was his best friend, Yun. Elsewhere across the city, James' girlfriend was also being mourned. All 3 had died together that night. According to reports, James' parents struggled to comprehend how their son could be gone. They kept returning to one thought over and over again. James loved fitness. He spent most of his free time in the gym. And they reportedly kept asking, how could even that not save him? They also worried deeply about James' younger brother, grieving not only the loss itself, but the emptiness now left behind inside their family. Friends who survived but had not attended Itaewon that night reportedly came to the funeral home together. They sat silently mourning James, and when they finished paying respects, they had to walk directly next door and grieve another friend too. Across South Korea, memorial altars began appearing in public spaces. People lined up quietly to pay respects to victims they had never even met. Flowers covered the memorials. Some mourners left bottles of soju beside photographs of the victims, a symbolic gesture connected to the night they had all gone out simply trying to celebrate. Others bowed deeply before the memorials, a traditional Korean sign of profound respect for the dead. And for a while, the entire country seemed suspended in grief. Across South Korea, people gathered at memorials holding candles late into the night. Flowers piled higher each day. Photos of the victims lined the streets. And it's estimated that more than 100,000 people came out to mourn. For a while, the country felt united in grief. But slowly, that grief began turning into anger. Because people wanted answers. They wanted to know how something like this could happen. And almost immediately, attention turned towards something survivors had repeatedly described: the pushers. Many survivors later gave interviews saying that while they were trapped in the alleyway struggling to breathe, they could hear people behind them yelling, "Push, push, push." Several survivors described the pressure coming in waves. The crowd would briefly stabilize, then suddenly surge forward again violently, like being hit repeatedly by an ocean wave. And what disturbed many people afterward was the belief that at least some individuals near the back were intentionally pushing harder to force their way through the crowd. More and more witnesses came forward, claiming they heard groups of young men shouting for people to push forward. One survivor even recalled hearing someone yell, "Ah, fuck it, just push, kids." Others described hearing crowds chanting variations of "push, push, push." One of the most talked about witness accounts involved a man reportedly wearing rabbit ears, or a rabbit headband. Some survivors claimed he appeared to be encouraging people behind him to surge forward. One witness later described the entire experience in horrifying detail. They said, "It felt like hell." People in front of them were screaming that they couldn't breathe. People behind them kept pushing. Their feet lifted off the ground. And in the middle of all of it, they said someone eventually grabbed them and pulled them towards safety. Even afterward, they remembered hearing music still playing nearby while people died around them. Another survivor later said the experience completely shattered their faith in humanity. But as investigators and experts later analyzed what happened, the reality became more complicated. Because in massive crowd disasters, people near the back often don't understand the danger unfolding farther ahead. Some individuals may have genuinely believed the crowd simply wasn't moving fast enough. Others may have been panicking themselves. And in Korean, an additional layer of confusion may have made the situation even worse. Some survivors reported hearing people yell, "Mito," meaning push, while others were yelling, "Treatle," meaning back up. Amid deafening music, screaming, and panic inside an overcrowded alleyway, those commands may have blurred together into chaos. Half the crowd trying to retreat, half trying to move forward, and once a crowd reaches critical density, even small surges become catastrophic. But online, many people wanted a face to blame. Internet users began hunting for the so-called rabbit headband man. Photos circulated rapidly online. People tracked down social media accounts. Accusations exploded across Korean internet forums. Eventually, one man wearing a rabbit headband publicly responded online, saying that he and his friends had already left the area before the crush began. He even posted subway records, attempting to prove it. Authorities later reportedly confirmed that he was not present in the alleyway during the deadly surge itself and was not considered responsible. But by then, the online witch hunts had already spread much further. People desperately wanted someone concrete to blame. At one point, even public figures and celebrities became targets of speculation. Some internet users blamed streamers who had broadcast themselves visiting Itaewon that night, claiming crowds may have followed them there. Others spread rumors involving celebrities supposedly spotted in the district. One celebrity heavily discussed online afterward was In, with rumors falsely suggesting crowds gathered because he was nearby. But his agency later stated he wasn't even in South Korea at the time. And honestly, in the aftermath, it increasingly felt like many people were struggling with the same impossible reality. There was no single villain, no single moment, no one individual solely responsible for 158 deaths. Instead, the tragedy appeared to be the result of overcrowding, ignored warnings, inadequate crowd control, delayed emergency response, confusion, panic, and a situation that spiraled beyond control long before authorities fully understood what was happening. Briefly, public anger shifted again, this time toward the businesses lining the alleyway. Online, people began asking, why didn't the bars help? Why didn't they pull people inside? Why didn't they stop the crowd surge? One business in particular, Waikiki Bar, became the center of heavy backlash, after videos appeared to show staff shutting their doors while people outside were screaming for help. Almost immediately, internet users flooded the business with accusations. But employees later tried to explain what happened from their perspective. According to staff, when people first started running toward the entrances, they didn't yet understand there was a deadly crowd crush unfolding outside. They thought intoxicated partygoers were simply panicking or causing chaos. Halloween in Itaewon was already loud, crowded, and chaotic by nature. So initially, they locked the doors. But employees later stated that once they realized people were actually dying in the alleyway, they opened up and began pulling victims inside. Many reportedly performed CPR themselves. One employee later gave an emotional interview saying, "I'll never forget the look in the eyes of the people I tried to save." He also described a distinct smell lingering around the crowd crush that he said still haunted him afterward. According to him, the trauma never really left. He reportedly struggled to sleep, needed sedatives, and said no amount of alcohol helped him forget what he had seen that night. But online anger didn't disappear. And in some ways, it intensified after reports emerged suggesting businesses in Itaewon had previously complained about heavy police presence because they feared it discouraged nightlife and hurt profits. Some officials implied that businesses had wanted fewer officers patrolling the area during Halloween festivities. Business owners strongly pushed back against those claims. Some reportedly responded with frustration, saying, "Even if businesses complained, are you seriously saying police just listened and did nothing?" Many local owners argued they were being unfairly scapegoated for failures that should have been handled by city officials and emergency planners. And economically, Itaewon itself began collapsing afterward. For years, the district had been known for nightlife, bars, restaurants, crowded streets, music, tourists. But after the tragedy, many people said it no longer felt right to go there and celebrate. Business owners who had already suffered financially during COVID-19 suddenly found themselves dealing with another disaster entirely. Some described Itaewon afterward as feeling almost like a ghost town, and many workers inside those businesses were traumatized too, not just financially devastated, but emotionally shattered after spending that night trying to pull bodies from the crowd and perform CPR on strangers. But eventually, public anger moved toward a much larger target, the government. Because, for many South Koreans, the Itaewon tragedy reopened wounds that had never truly healed after another national disaster years earlier, the Sewol ferry sinking. That disaster killed around 300 people, many of them high school students, and became deeply associated with accusations of incompetence, delayed response, greed, and systemic failure. The trauma from Sewol still lingered heavily in South Korea when Itaewon happened, and many people felt they were watching history repeat itself. On October 29th itself, there had also been large demonstrations happening across Yongsan District, the area of Seoul where Itaewon is located. Reports indicated there were numerous protests and rallies occurring that day, involving tens of thousands of participants. Almost immediately, political arguments exploded online. Some conservatives argued that too many police resources had been assigned to managing protests instead of crowd control in Itaewon. Others pushed back hard against that argument, saying authorities should have anticipated Halloween crowds regardless and deployed additional officers if necessary. And then attention shifted directly towards South Korea's president at the time, Yoon Suk-yeol. President Yoon had previously made the controversial decision to relocate the presidential office from the Blue House into Yongsan District, the Blue House being South Korea's White House. Critics argued that enormous police resources had been redirected toward presidential security in the area. Some reports and political opponents claimed hundreds of officers were being used to secure presidential operations, while Halloween preparations in Itaewon appeared severely understaffed. That accusation quickly fueled a massive political divide. The left blamed government incompetence and misplaced priorities. The right accused opponents of politicizing a tragedy. And before long, the Itaewon crowd crush had become more than a disaster investigation. It had become a national political war. When massive concerts happen, authorities prepare. When major sporting events happen, authorities prepare. Any situation involving huge crowds usually comes with detailed planning. Police deployment, emergency medical staff, crowd control barriers, traffic flow management, emergency evacuation plans. There are protocols, because officials understand one very important thing. Large crowds can become dangerous extremely quickly. And that's one of the biggest reasons people became so furious after Itaewon. Because, according to many critics, there appeared to be almost no meaningful crowd control presence there that night at all. Even though the entire city knew Halloween weekend in Itaewon was going to be enormous. Businesses had reportedly been preparing for weeks. Restaurants stocked extra inventory. Taxi drivers anticipated massive demand. Partygoers planned their costumes days in advance. Everyone seemed prepared for huge crowds, except the authorities responsible for public safety. And that anger only intensified once the timeline became clearer. The first emergency warning call reportedly came in around 6:30 p.m., hours before the deadly crush. People repeatedly warned police that the alleyway near Hamilton Hotel was becoming dangerously overcrowded. One streamer even physically walked into a police station around 9 p.m., warning officers directly that conditions in Itaewon were becoming unsafe. And yet, despite all of those warnings, survivors and witnesses repeatedly described seeing almost no active crowd control in the alley itself before the tragedy unfolded. For many South Koreans, especially with the trauma of the Sewol ferry sinking still fresh in memory, the similarities felt horrifying. Once again, many believed ordinary people had warned authorities about danger before disaster struck. And once again, they felt those warnings had not been taken seriously enough. People were furious, because they felt this tragedy wasn't simply unavoidable bad luck. They believed it was preventable. One of the most emotional points raised afterward was the fact that one of the first officers actively trying to redirect crowds that night, Officer Kim Baek-kyum, reportedly hadn't even been dispatched there. He simply encountered the chaos while already nearby and tried to help on his own. One officer, one voice. Inside crowds estimated at around 130,000 people, many of them wearing Halloween costumes resembling police uniforms themselves. Music blasting, people screaming, crowds moving in every direction. It was chaos. Critics argued that the warning signs had been obvious long before 10 p.m. Even subway stations were becoming dangerously overcrowded as massive numbers of people funneled toward Itaewon Station and eventually toward the narrow alleyway connecting the entertainment district. Many people afterwards said the government had a responsibility to anticipate exactly this kind of situation, to prepare, to monitor crowd density, to deploy officers earlier, to control pedestrian flow before conditions became deadly. And then came another controversy that further inflamed public anger. During an international press conference following the disaster, South Korean Prime Minister Han Duck-soo appeared to struggle hearing a translator through his earpiece. At one point, smiling awkwardly, he reportedly asked, "Who's responsible for me not hearing the interpreter?" For many viewers, especially while the country was grieving the deaths of mostly young people, the moment came across as shockingly tone-deaf. Clips spread rapidly online. People accused him of appearing unserious during one of the country's worst disasters in years. Some online comments reportedly said things like, "How can anyone smile during this? Is this really the time for jokes? People's children just died." The backlash became so intense that the following day, Han Duck-soo publicly apologized. But by then, public trust had already begun collapsing further, and for many grieving families, apologies no longer felt enough. One controversy that especially angered the public involved the 16-year-old survivor who later died by suicide after losing his two closest friends in the crowd crush. As we talked about earlier, his parents had reportedly done everything they could to help him afterward. He attended therapy. He received school counseling. His family took his trauma seriously. But despite those efforts, the grief and survivor's guilt became overwhelming. When the case was later discussed publicly, comments made by Han Duck-soo sparked major backlash. During discussions about mental health support following the tragedy, the Prime Minister essentially stated that while the government could provide mental health resources, victims themselves also needed to actively commit to receiving treatment and continuing care. The comments were widely criticized online. Many people felt the response sounded cold and overly clinical, considering the scale of trauma survivors had endured. Others argued it unfairly placed responsibility back onto victims who were already psychologically devastated. And another issue quickly emerged afterward, whether the teenager should officially be recognized as a victim of the Itaewon tragedy. Initially, reports indicated that authorities did not include him in the official death toll because his death occurred weeks later and was classified separately. But many people, especially victims' families and mental health advocates, strongly disagreed with that distinction, because to them, his death was directly connected to the crowd crush. If his friends had not died, if he had not experienced that trauma, they believed he likely would still be alive. Eventually, after mounting public pressure, the South Korean government reportedly agreed to officially recognize him as a victim connected to the Itaewon disaster. And for his parents, that recognition reportedly mattered deeply. Not because of compensation, not because of financial assistance, but because they believed the truth mattered. Their son was not simply struggling in isolation. He was another casualty of that night, a survivor who physically escaped the crowd, but emotionally never truly left it. After the government's initial response, Yoon Suk-yeol publicly offered condolences to the victims and their families. But for many grieving parents, the statements felt cold, scripted, like public relations rather than genuine accountability. One parent reportedly said, "This is just a PR response." They argued that what families really wanted wasn't carefully written condolences. They wanted proof that meaningful changes were being implemented so something like this could never happen again. Another victim's mother became so angry that she reportedly tore apart condolence wreaths said by the president and the mayor of Seoul. According to reports, she said, "The government failed to protect our children. Flowers are useless. And honestly, one of the most heartbreaking voices throughout all of this was the father of the young woman I mentioned earlier, the girl dressed as Princess Jasmine from Aladdin. Her name was Yejin. She had shown her costume proudly to her father before leaving that night, twirling around and asking if she looked pretty. She was his only child. After her death, her father reportedly visited her memorial every single day. In one interview, he said something that devastated people across South Korea. He said, "Children who lose their parents are called orphans, but there is no word for parents who lose their children." Then he added, "I think I found one. Sinner." He blamed himself for losing her, even though there was nothing he could have done. The government later offered financial assistance for funeral costs and medical support for survivors, but many families said money wasn't the point. Yejin's father reportedly said, "We can live without the money. We cannot live without our daughter." To many grieving families, financial compensation felt hollow without accountability. What they wanted most was honesty, an investigation, answers, acknowledgement that catastrophic failures had occurred. Many parents openly described the tragedy not simply as an accident, but as death caused by negligence, by a lack of planning, a lack of crowd control, a lack of emergency response. Some families reportedly struggled to comprehend how authorities could have failed so badly despite multiple warnings throughout the night. One grieving parent simply shook their head and said, "I don't understand it. I just don't understand." And adding even more pain to everything, many families were horrified by some of the online reactions afterward. Because alongside sympathy, there were also cruel accusations blaming the victims themselves. People online criticized young adults for partying, for drinking, for attending crowded streets during Halloween, but survivors and experts repeatedly emphasized that this wasn't simply reckless partying spiraling out of control. Alcohol may have contributed to confusion or slower reactions in some cases, but the core issue was crowd density and the absence of proper crowd management. Two massive streams of people moving in opposite directions through a narrow downhill alleyway, music drowning out communication, no coordinated control, no clear crowd flow, no ability to move once the crush began. People weren't dying because they were disorderly, they were dying because they physically could no longer breathe. One parent reportedly asked a question that deeply resonated across the country. Did our children deserve to die just because they went out to have fun? I don't think that's right. And for many people, that question became the emotional center of the entire tragedy. Because these were not people knowingly entering danger. They were young people celebrating Halloween after years of pandemic restrictions, expecting to come home afterward. As public anger kept growing, the tension increasingly shifted toward law enforcement leadership, especially the leadership of the Yongsan Police Department, the district responsible for Itaewon that night. As more details emerged after the tragedy, public outrage toward the police only intensified. Because according to reports, authorities were not completely unaware that huge crowds were expected in Itaewon that night. Far from it. Halloween in Itaewon was already exploding across social media before October 29th even arrived. Influencers, YouTubers, streamers, many openly told followers they would be there. Videos about Itaewon Halloween nightlife were trending everywhere. The crowds were not a surprise. And despite that, reports later indicated that only around 137 officers were actually assigned to duty in the Itaewon area that night. Some reports suggested police had initially considered deploying around 200 officers for Halloween operations, but even that would likely have been nowhere near enough for crowds estimated at roughly 130,000 people. And what angered the public even more was the sheer number of warnings authorities received before the crush began. According to later investigations and reports, between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., 28 reports were made about dangerous overcrowding. Between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., another 51 reports flooded in. Then shortly before the disaster itself, another 71 reports warned that people were being crushed and could not move. Again and again, callers reportedly described the same thing. People trapped, people unable to breathe, people falling. Yet despite the mounting warnings, survivors repeatedly said they saw almost no meaningful crowd control presence before the disaster unfolded. One survivor later said, "It would have helped if there had been police maintaining order, but I didn't see any." And after the tragedy, public scrutiny turned heavily toward Lee M.J., the chief of the Yongsan Police Department at the time. His actions that night became deeply controversial. Initially, Lee reportedly claimed he arrived at the scene quickly and took command of rescue efforts. But later investigations and reporting painted a very different timeline. Earlier that evening, he had reportedly been overseeing demonstrations near the presidential office in Yongsan. Afterward, around 9:24 p.m., he reportedly went to dinner with other officers. Investigators later stated he was informed of worsening crowd conditions around 9:30 p.m. But according to reports, he did not immediately rush toward Itaewon. Instead, he continued eating for a period of time afterward. And one detail especially enraged the public. The restaurant was reportedly only about a 10-minute walk from the police station, but rather than walk, Lee chose to drive through heavy traffic. Traffic that night was severely congested, meaning while people were dying in the alleyway, the police chief was reportedly stuck in traffic for nearly an hour. CCTV footage later released reportedly showed him walking calmly near the station later that night with his hands behind his back. Footage many critics argued appeared disturbingly casual considering the scale of the unfolding disaster. Reports indicated he did not return to the station until around 10:55 p.m., nearly an hour after the crush had already begun. And according to criticism afterward, even then there was confusion and delay rather than immediate large-scale emergency coordination. The controversy deepened further when Lee later reportedly claimed he had previously requested additional police forces for Halloween crowd safety, but had been denied. Investigators later disputed that claim, saying no such formal requests had actually been made. Meanwhile, another officer from the Yongsan Police Department reportedly stated that he had warned superiors ahead of Halloween about the need for crowd control planning in Itaewon. According to reports, he was allegedly told to prioritize protests occurring near the presidential office instead, and this became one of the most explosive revelations of all. Because while Itaewon reportedly had only around 137 officers assigned that night, 4,700 highly trained crowd control police were already deployed elsewhere inside Yongsan District, handling demonstrations and presidential security operations, along with 1,100 regular police officers. Critics argued that officers trained specifically for crowd management were located relatively nearby, yet were never redirected to Itaewon, even as emergency calls escalated. And perhaps most disturbing to many people, reports later indicated that the officers assigned to Itaewon that night were reportedly focused primarily on drug enforcement and crime patrols, not crowd safety management. There was reportedly no major coordinated crowd control operation, no large-scale pedestrian flow system, no active management plan for the alleyway itself, and for grieving families, that realization became almost unbearable. Because many believed the disaster wasn't caused by one unavoidable moment of chaos. They believed it was the result of warning after warning after warning being ignored. Public anger eventually turned into criminal investigations, and by the end of 2022, authorities began arresting officials connected to the response failures surrounding the Itaewon tragedy. On December 23, 2022, Lee M.J. was arrested. Nearly 2 years later, in September 2024, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for professional negligence connected to failures in responding to the disaster. But he wasn't the only official investigated. 2 additional police officers were also arrested after allegations emerged that they had instructed subordinates to destroy internal reports connected to emergency warning calls made before the crush. According to investigators, some officials were accused of attempting to erase records documenting how many warnings police had actually received that night and how emergency services responded. There were also accusations involving falsified timelines and altered response records. And as investigations expanded, more indictments followed. By January 2023, reports indicated that 23 people had been indicted in connection with the tragedy. Roughly half were police officers. Others included local officials, and emergency response personnel. Many faced accusations tied to professional negligence, failure to prevent foreseeable danger, or attempting to destroy or alter official documents that could later serve as criminal evidence. Another major figure investigated was Kim Kwang-ho, the chief of the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency at the time. Because the Seoul Metropolitan Police oversaw policing operations across the capital, many critics believed responsibility extended far beyond just the local Yongsan department. Kim Kwang-ho became one of the highest-ranking officials investigated after the disaster. However, unlike Lee Im-jae, he was later acquitted in 2024 after the court ruled prosecutors had not proven criminal negligence beyond a reasonable doubt. Even so, public criticism surrounding him never fully disappeared, because for many South Koreans, the Itaewon disaster reflected failures at nearly every level. Planning failures, communication failures, crowd control failures, emergency response failures. And while some officials faced prison sentences, many grieving families still felt nobody had truly been held accountable for the scale of what happened that night. Another major question raised after the tragedy involved the subway system. Specifically, why wasn't Seoul Metropolitan Subway instructed to stop servicing Itaewon Station once the crowds became dangerously large? Because for many people afterward, that seemed like one of the simplest ways to prevent the area from becoming even more overcrowded, especially considering Itaewon Station sits directly beside the narrow alleyway where the deadly crush occurred. Throughout the night, thousands upon thousands of people continued pouring out of that station and into already packed streets. So naturally, many people wondered, why didn't authorities shut the station down? Why didn't trains bypass Itaewon entirely? Why did crowds continue flowing into an area already spiraling into chaos? And afterward, police and transportation officials appeared to offer very different explanations. According to police statements made later, officers claimed they had requested measures involving the subway system once conditions worsened. Some reports indicated police said they asked whether trains could bypass Itaewon Station or whether transportation officials could help disperse crowds by offering free exits and rerouting passengers elsewhere. But according to transit officials, that version of events wasn't entirely accurate. The Metro Department reportedly responded by saying police never clearly communicated that there was an unfolding emergency requiring immediate intervention. Instead, officials described the conversations more as general procedural questions, asking how requests for free exits or station management would normally work. And transit authorities argued something important. Closing or bypassing a subway station in the middle of a massive crowd event isn't as simple as just skipping a stop. Because if thousands of passengers are suddenly prevented from exiting at one station without proper crowd control planning elsewhere, the dangerous overcrowding doesn't disappear. It simply shifts somewhere else, potentially creating another crush situation at nearby stations. Transit officials reportedly stated that any emergency station closure would require heavy police coordination on the ground, crowd guidance, barricades, alternative routing, large-scale pedestrian management, and according to their account, that level of coordinated emergency planning never fully happened that night. So once again, the tragedy seemed to expose the same devastating problem seen throughout nearly every part of the response: miscommunication, lack of coordination, delays, and agencies appearing disconnected from one another while conditions deteriorated in real time. By the end of it all, many South Koreans were left feeling that no single system completely failed that night, but rather that multiple systems failed simultaneously: police, emergency response, crowd management, communication between agencies, and the ability to react quickly once warning signs became impossible to ignore. Another official who came under investigation after the tragedy was Choi Sung-bom, the chief of the Yongsan Fire Department. Police investigators argued that emergency response management at the scene had been inadequate and claimed that poor coordination by fire officials contributed to the severity of the disaster. But unlike the criticism directed toward police leadership, many people strongly disagreed with targeting the firefighters, because from the public's perspective, firefighters had not been responsible for preventing the crowd crush in the first place. They were the ones who arrived afterward, trying desperately to save lives. And according to many witnesses, Firefighters and paramedics were among the few groups visibly throwing themselves into the chaos without hesitation. Reports indicated that even prosecutors at one stage reportedly questioned whether pursuing charges against Fire Chief Choi was appropriate. Many firefighters publicly defended him. They believed he was being turned into another scapegoat. And unlike the widespread anger directed at police leadership and government officials, many South Koreans appeared to have sympathy for the firefighters who responded that night. There's often a level of public distrust toward police in major disasters, but many people saw firefighters as genuine first responders trying to rescue victims under impossible conditions. Firefighters later spoke emotionally about what they witnessed in Itaewon. Some reportedly said they had given absolutely everything they had physically and mentally that night, and still could not save enough people. Others later reviewed body camera footage from the disaster, trying to learn what could be improved for future emergency responses. One firefighter made a statement afterward that resonated with many people. He reportedly said, "When I watched the footage back, I noticed there wasn't a single moment where any of us were walking, only running, constantly running, trying to reach victims, trying to perform CPR, trying to move bodies, trying to save anyone they still could." And many people contrasted that image sharply against the criticism surrounding some police leadership during the disaster. As investigations continued, grieving families kept pushing for accountability. Not revenge, not political arguments, justice. One quote from victims' parents especially stayed with many South Koreans. They said, "Please serve our children justice on their way to heaven." And outside memorial sites, signs appeared carrying another message that became symbolic of the tragedy itself. "Please don't forget us. Please don't forget Itaewon." Because for the families left behind, one of the greatest fears was that eventually the news cycle would move on, while their grief never would. The morning after the tragedy, the alleyway in Itaewon no longer looked like a place people had gathered to celebrate Halloween. It looked haunted. Police tape blocked the entrances, shoes still littered the ground. Pieces of clothing, bags, IDs, and personal belongings remained scattered throughout the narrow slope. Remnants of panic, remnants of lives interrupted in an instant. And on October 30th, one moment captured the grief hanging over Itaewon more than almost anything else. An elderly shop owner quietly walked out from his small business near the alleyway. In his hands, he carried a pink cloth, a tray of food, and 2 candles. Without saying much, he carefully placed the cloth down inside the alley where so many people had died just hours earlier. Then he arranged the food on top of it, lit the candles, and dropped to his knees. Witnesses said he began sobbing, not quietly, not holding it in, just completely breaking apart in the middle of the alley. Police officers quickly approached him because the area had already been sealed off. No one was supposed to enter. The officers reportedly told him gently that he needed to leave and take everything with him. But the old man refused. He pleaded with them, then finally shouted, "Don't touch the food." More officers arrived and began trying to clear the area. And according to witnesses, the man completely broke down. Because to him, this wasn't simply food left on the ground. It was something sacred. He reportedly cried out, "The children need one last meal. One last meal." And suddenly the atmosphere shifted. One of the officers reportedly sat down beside him right there in the alley. The officer placed a hand on the man's back, and both of them started crying together. The elderly man later explained that he owned a small shop nearby. He had witnessed the disaster unfold firsthand. He said he had tried to help people, tried to save as many as he could, but there were simply too many victims, too many bodies, too many screams, too many people dying right in front of him. And so the next morning, he returned carrying food for the dead, one final meal for the young people who never made it home. By that point, 159 people had lost their lives in Itaewon, and for many South Koreans, that image of the grieving old man kneeling in the alleyway became symbolic of the entire tragedy. Not politics, not blame, not investigations, just heartbreak.